Okay, so we're in the balance room again. I've got my crude aspirin, right? And I've got another weigh boat because we're going to purify our aspirin, but we're only going to purify about half of it. So I'm going to do that. Put the weigh boat on here and zero out the weigh boat, the empty one. And now I'm going to put about half the aspirin in there. Half the crude aspirin that we're going to purify. Okay, so we still got plenty of crude aspirin, but we're going to purify here. We need to get a weight of how much we're going to purify, so we can see what our percent recovery is once we get the purification done. So we've got 1.023 grams. Okay, so that's how much we're going to purify. Okay, so we're over in the hood. I'm going to put the crude aspirin into a test tube here. Okay, I'm going to use my spatula here. Make sure I get it in there. A couple of big chunks. Okay, because we're trying to purify this. Get all that in there. Okay, so we got most of it. Alright, and it says to add 10 milliliters of diethyl ether for every gram. Now we had roughly a gram, a little bit over, so we're going to go maybe a little over 10 milliliters of diethyl ether. Okay, so diethyl ether is very flammable, has a very low flash point, so we're going to turn the hood on for this. Alright, so I need to measure out, both of these bottles have diethyl ether in there, but there's not much in this first one. So I'm going to measure out 10 milliliters, because we have a little over a gram. Okay, there's more in here than I thought. Alright, so there's 10 milliliters. Diethyl ether. And like I said, we need a little bit more. We should have about 10.23. So we're going to put a little bit more in here. Now, it doesn't actually have markings that low, but we're going to put about 10 and a half. And we need to know that amount because we're going to use that amount later of a different solvent. Alright, that says to stir this well until it dissolves. Okay, so just move this out of the way. Got my, okay, so we're stirring this up to get all of the aspirin to dissolve in the ether. cold because it takes a little bit of energy to dissolve. So this is taking a little while. Okay, so it finally all dissolved, and as you can see, I've added quite a bit more ether to it to get it all to dissolve. Okay, so now I've got to dry it by adding sodium sulfate anhydrous. Okay, and I've already weighed out about 0.5 grams, and I'm going to add that to dry the ether here. Okay, and then I'm going to mix it and let it set to dry for a few minutes, and then I'm going to pour it into a large test tube, and I'm going to have to use a larger one because then I'm going to add PET ether to it about twice, double the amount, so that way we can get crystals back. Alright, it's been a few minutes, so the ether has been dried, and so now I'm going to decant the ether into the larger test tube. So I'm going to leave the solid sodium sulfate behind that's settled to the bottom, and I'm going to pour off the liquid into this larger test tube. Let me get the ring stand out of the way if I can. Sorry about that. Okay, so I left all the solid sodium sulfate behind, and I've got all the ether out of there that contains our aspirin. Alright, dissolved up our aspirin and whatever else was in there. Okay, so I'm ready to add the petroleum ether here, and I'm going to add enough so that it doubles the volume that's in there. Just going to measure this out a little bit. Okay, that's a little more than 10. Like I say, I'm going to need about 20 milliliters because I had to add a lot of ether to get it to go, the first part. So I've added about 17 milliliters of PET ether. Add a little bit more. Okay, so we're up to basically about 20 milliliters of PET ether. Alright, and then it says to stopper it and stick it in an ice bath, and we'll see if we get crystals. Okay, so the test tube has been in the ice bath for a good 20-25 minutes, and you can see there's a good amount of crystals down here at the bottom. Alright, and so what I'm going to need to do is I need to isolate these crystals, and I'm going to use a vacuum filtration setup that you've used before to isolate the crude aspirin. So I've set it up again, and remember that in the Buchner funnel here there's a little piece of filter paper. Now, if you remember from before, we wanted to wet the filter paper to make a good seal before we turn on the vacuum. Okay, well this time though we're not going to wet it with water because we just got rid of all the water. This time we're going to have to wet it with a little bit of PET ether, and I've already been chilling some PET ether here to do as a rinse. So I'm going to use just a few drops of that to wet the filter paper, and then I'm going to start up the vacuum, and I'm going to try to get the solid out of here. Okay? Alright, so here we go. Okay. Put a little bit of the PET ether on there. Turn on the vacuum. Okay, so I'm going to need to use a stir rod to get the solid out of the bottom here. Get our crystals out if I can. All right, and I'm going to use a little bit of the pet ether rinse to help me. Okay, so I got a spatula here to help me get the solid out of the test tube, because this is a much larger test tube than what we usually work with. Although there's not a whole lot of solid left in here. Okay, and again I'm going to use some more of the pet ether to rinse. One more time here. Okay, so again, I didn't get it all out of there, but I got a pretty good, most of it out of there. And then I'm going to show you what the crystals look like up here on the filter paper. Okay, so now I'm looking down at the crystals, and you can see how nice and pretty they look, okay, because they're pure. So I'm just letting the vacuum go here for a while, just because that's the way I'm going to dry these. There's not that much here, and so I won't have to put these in the oven. And so then the next thing to do is to get a weight. Okay, so I'm here in the balance room, and I'm going to get a weight of my pure crystals. So I'm putting a weigh boat on here and zero out the weigh boat. Okay, and so now I'm going to scrape the crystals off my filter paper and see, like I say, it comes off pretty easy. Okay. You may say, oh, well, that's not, doesn't look like that much solid, right? But remember, if you're taking aspirin, right, what are you going to want? You're going to want it to be very, very pure. So when you purify it, usually you sacrifice, right, amount for purity. Okay. All right, so that is the amount of purified aspirin I got back after doing the purification. 0.411 grams. Okay, so before we start doing some of the characterization tests, I just wanted to do a simple physical comparison of the two things. So the crude is over here on the left. This is the crude aspirin, the stuff that we didn't purify. And then this is the purified aspirin over here on your right. Okay, so this will give you a chance so that you can do some observations on the differences between them.